Good morning, everyone.
Nice to see you.
Good morning, everyone.
Okay. Good morning. We are ready to start the second day of the summer school. We are very happy to welcome as our first speaker, Stan De Haan, who all of you probably know. He is currently the director of the Neurospin in France, and he is best known in the field of consciousness research for his work in developing the global neuronal space theory of consciousness, as well as many other interesting lines of work that he's been developing. And today he will be talking about subliminal and conscious processing from the global neuronal workspace perspective. So Stan, whenever you're ready, we'll be delighted to hear your talk.
All right. I guess this has the wrong title, but never mind. Got the topic. Hello, everybody. I would like to share with you some recent reflections on consciousness, but also a sort of global perspective on how we should be able to study it and the predictions from this global workspace theory. I believe this is a course for people who have not been introduced too much to the field. So I will start from very simple arguments, and then I'll build up to much more recent experiments, some of them unpublished. All of that in half an hour, hopefully. I don't know if you have already seen this beautiful illusion. I'm using this illusion and many others as a way to show how we can study consciousness. We can study consciousness because we can dissociate the objective stimulus from the subjective visibility. So what's happening here? Is there an illusion? There's nothing special. It's just a nice image of a checkerboard. Well, yes, but the exact same luminance is being used for these two places in the image, and yet you see one as dark and the other as light. And this is really a super powerful illusion. Let me try to show this to you by bringing in a square. This square is exactly the same gray as this one, but if I move it around, it's also exactly the same light gray as this one. And if I move it again, it changes to another color, another darkness. So what's going on? Well, this and many other illusions have been argued to indicate a process of unconscious inference. You see the result of a computation, which is not the original image that touches your retina. I'm not sure why all of these zoom windows keep popping up. Let me try to get rid of them once and for all. All right. The idea is that, of course, the image that impinges on the retina has the original gray level, which is exactly the same, but the system detects that in this case, there's something that looks like a shadow. Of course, it's not really a shadow, it's just a dark zone on the image, but it's consistent with the shadow projected by this object here. And so the visual system unconsciously subtracts or gets rid of the influence of the shadow, and therefore lets you perceive this object as much lighter. It's just one example of the very sophisticated computations that are going on sub rosa unconsciously before you get any consciousness of the overall image. So I think it will relate to a key idea of this presentation and of much of my work, that early perceptual processing is largely unconscious, and we are conscious only of a late part of the processing, which relates to a late wave of long-lasting neuronal activity that actually integrates signal, in this case over the image, integrates signal into a global network. And we are conscious only of the output of these computations. So this has been formalized in part with Jean-Pierre Changeux and with Lionel Nakache as the global neuronal workspace hypothesis. The idea is quite simple. First of all, we have to acknowledge that a lot of processing in the brain is unconscious. Virtually every one of these chains of processes, which are depicted in little circles here, imagine them as brain areas, they are virtually all operating unconsciously. So what is consciousness? Well, according to this view, it is the global availability of information. One of these processes makes it into an inner circle, a global neural workspace that has evolved to select a piece of information and to broadcast it in a brain-one manner. And what we call being conscious is the broadcasting. Is when a piece of information is made available to all of our thought processes. So a characteristic of being conscious of information is that we can speak about it, we can explain it to others, but we can also use it in our behavior in all sorts of ways, in flexible manner. This flexibility, according to the model, is provided by this system of long distance connections that spread the information around virtually to every processor. So of course, this is a system that is limited in its capacity. You could not broadcast all information everywhere all at the same time. That would be chaos. So this is a selective system that selects information. When it is selected, it ignites this distributed system. So I'll be speaking about this ignition in a quite literal sense of the lighting up simultaneously of many processors, and sends top-down signal all the way back to the original processor. So holding the information online for a sufficient amount of time. But that's a bottleneck. You cannot do that for many pieces of information at once. You do it for one of them. And so it will block the processing of the conscious processing, at least, of other pieces of information. So we see here that there are several ways of becoming unconscious. One is that the information was never strong enough in the first place, so it dies before reaching the workspace. This is what we call subliminal. But another possibility is that the information is strong enough, but you're not conscious of it because you're not attending to it, you're not letting it enter into the workspace. And that could be because you're distracted by other processes that are going on at the same time. There's quite a bit of anatomical evidence now for this idea of a central bottleneck at the level of high-level brain areas such as prefrontal cortex, but I insist this is not a localizationist theory. It's not just prefrontal cortex. It's a network of areas that have been nicely laid down in this paper by Henry Kennedy, for instance, prefrontal cortex, and for instance, association areas of the parietal and temporal lobes, and also midline cortical areas. And of course, the thalamus and the non-specific nuclei of the thalamus in particular are interconnected to this system. So it's not one specific location, but a system. So, and yeah, what is common to all conscious processing states, according to this model, is not a single state or a single marker or NCC, but it's more like a processing style, a type of neural trajectory that makes it into this high level and is able to spread. So it's not a static model either. The information needs to be held on in working memory when it is conscious, but also it can spread and change. This is conscious processing. So there are many, many predictions. I will not have time today to detail all of these predictions. I sent you some papers where these are partially reviewed. So the first prediction is that unconscious processing can be very deep. And when we do subliminal processing can go quite far. But the second is that there will be a sudden global ignition, particularly in prefrontal cortex, whenever novel contents gains access to consciousness. So, oh, this is annoying. Each time someone enters the waiting room, I get signals from Zoom. Let me try to get rid of that again, sorry. This sudden ignition should be visible both in brain imaging signals as well as in single cell recordings. And I'll try to show you both. There are several other predictions. Oh yeah, so crucially, what is being broadcasted is the detailed contents of everything that you are conscious of. So everything that you are conscious of should be perceptible, should be decodable in, for instance, prefrontal cortex neurons and surrounding assemblies connected to it. So we should be able to decode, ultimately, what the subject is conscious of, even if it's an exotic illusion from prefrontal cortex neurons. I'll show you some evidence of that. There are other predictions, such as central collision, only one object at a time, or spontaneous ignition, the fact that this is not a system that's waiting for the input, but actually can spontaneously ignite from memory, just when you're in darkness, when you're just sitting there, you're still conscious. So this is spontaneous activity can traverse the global workspace, not just bottom up, as it is the case here. But in the interest of time, I'll focus on this notion of global ignition. So we've done a lot of work on that. This is quite old work now, but the idea was always the same, was to use masking, another visual illusion, in order to follow subliminal versus conscious processes. If you flash a digit, could also be a word or a picture. If you follow it by the appropriate mask, in this case, these are letters that surround the location of the digit in the periphery of the visual system, then you will not see the digit. If it's short enough, and this is shown here, if it's below 50 milliseconds, the delay between the digit and the mask, you will just not see the digit at all. It's a very powerful illusion. Around 50 milliseconds is the threshold for most people. There's some variability, but then above 50, you become conscious. And so if we study this at the physiological level, there are some of the early recordings we got from EEG, and now we do that with MEG, magnetoencephalography. But you can see a first wave of activation followed by a second wave of activation in visual cortex, in the ventral visual pathway. And you can also see a late wave. This late wave occurs also in the prefrontal cortex and in many other areas. And what has been quite remarkable is that the first wave is very linear as a function of the delay, and in particular exists, and is quite strong, for instance, in this green curve here, when the stimulus is not seen at 33 milliseconds. But the second wave tends to be much more all or none and to follow the consciousness of the subject. So on the right, you have the conscious reports of seeing here, and you have the size of this late wave, which has been called P3B in the literature, on the scalp of the subject, but at the source level, you can see it also. And here, subliminal stimuli have gone to zero, and only the conscious stimuli have been show a high level of activity or ignition. This phenomenon is so strong and nice that we can find it in much younger subjects, such as infants. It's of course very difficult to know objectively whether infants are conscious or not. But one way is to look for these signatures, a linear stage followed by a non-linear stage. And so in lovely work, Sid Quider was able, also with my wife Ghislaine and I, to record from event-related potentials and show that when a face is being presented and when it's masked, at the short duration, there is no late activity in these infants, but only at the long duration, suddenly there's a jump and we see this late activation. So even though the detailed topography is not exactly the same, the stages of processing are very similar. We see a linear stage where every increment in the delay between the face and the mask is reflected in the ERPs, and we see a late stage which is much more all or none ignition. So we've pursued this, and one way to pursue this is to use modern multivariate decoding techniques. I don't know if they've been exposed to this group already, but the idea is that with these techniques, you can actually take a slice of the data, a temporal slice. You have all of these recordings from EEG and from MEG, and they follow, for instance, a particular stimulus, such as the image of a face, a house, an object, or a body part. And you can train machine learning systems, such as a support vector machine or other device, to decide what was the image on screen, what was seen. And when you do this, you can decode what has been seen by the subject, but also you get a lot of information about the timing of these processes and how they unfold in time. So for instance, suppose that you have just different stages of processing, each with a different code. You can train a decoder at a given time, test its generalization at another time. And the prediction is that if it's a series of stages, then you should see a diagonal decoding. You can decode at a certain moment. It will generalize only to the local time, but it will not generalize to the other times. And this will show you an indication that this is a trajectory of processing. But if you have ignition and a more sustained, or we call it also metastable representation, then you should get this more square pattern of generalization. What you can decode at a certain moment, you can generalize to other times as well. So this is a very powerful method. It looks hypothetical, but this is what happens in this very experiment where we flash an image. This was done by Sébastien Marty, who's a very good friend who unfortunately disappeared way too soon a few years ago. So in this example, you see an example of both. You see very clearly that for the first initial stages of processing, you get this diagonal decoding. So a series of stages, we can decode the identity of the image from several of these times, but they don't easily generalize to other times. There's a series of stages. But late in the process, you have this much more square pattern of generalization, which is an indication of metastability or ignition, we've moved into a much more stable representation of the information. It's not perfect, as you can see, and we will discuss that in a second. But largely speaking, broadly speaking, the first stage corresponds to non-conscious processing, and the late stage corresponds to conscious processing. We just add some qualifications to that. So we've done that. We've applied these decoders to this masking situation, and this is what you get. This has been the lovely work of Jean-Rémy King, also Lucy Charles in the lab. The results are quite clear. You can decode whether there was or there was not a digit, even though the subject below 50 milliseconds claims there was no digit, you could not see it. We can decode, for instance, at 33 milliseconds, that there was a digit, even though it was not seen. So the decoder, in a sense, is better than the subject in this case. It's decoding information that the subject consciously does not have. But we can also decode it better and better as the duration crosses this threshold, and notice the change. The early part remains, but the late part is quite different as a function of the duration of presentation of the stimulus. And so what we can do is we can take this 50 milliseconds trial and separate them into seen versus unseen. It's the very same presentation duration. And in this case, we see a pure correlate of subjective visibility. And this is what I was telling you at the beginning. We can look for objective neural correlates of subjective processes, such as seeing or not seeing. So here the subject reports whether he's seeing or not, and you see what difference it makes. It's mostly in the late part of the epoch. It starts, of course, a little bit early, but it explodes into this big difference of late activity, which shows metastability, decodability over time. Now, Jean-Rémy King, who was doing his PhD in the lab, extended these ideas very much, and he's really the force being this behind this decoding idea. And so Jean-Rémy King was asking, what happens if we really try to hold on to subliminal information which has been masked during a certain delay? So he introduced this task, which is also nice because it's becoming, as you can see, to be much more of a psychophysical task. People have been asking me, do you see a sort of discrete all or none ignition because you're using symbolic stimuli like words or digits? So here we're no longer using symbolic stimuli. We're using a little grid like this, which can be oriented and has a certain spatial frequency, and it is masked after a certain delay. Again, we vary the delay here. The task of the subject is to try to remember the target and compare it with a probe, and has to decide whether the probe is tilted leftwards or tilted rightwards. But there is a long delay of several hundreds of milliseconds here, which allows us to test whether there is a memory of the target after this delay. And this is done under conditions that are close to invisibility. The subject reports using this scale whether he has not seen the target at all, or whether he had some degree of visibility. And the first finding is behavioral, is that there is still subliminal processing in these conditions. So even on the unseen trials, the subject's forced choice performance remains significantly above chance. So he's better than chance in deciding whether the probe is tilted to the right or tilted to the left, which means he has some memory of the original target that bridge across this delay. And in more recent work with Darinka Trubicek, several papers, we found that this can extend for several seconds. It's a sort of a short-term memory for subliminal stimuli. But still, there are huge differences between conscious and unconscious processing, and we can follow that through MEG. So we recorded MEG signals, magnetoencephalography signals, during this sort of task. And Jean-Rémy showed that we can decode so much information from these MEG signals. It was quite extraordinary. So you can decode, first of all, whether there was a target or not. You can decode what was its contrast, whether it was highly contrasted or not. You can decode its spatial frequency, and you can decode to some extent even its phase, the sort of grid, how it's shifted. And most importantly, you can decode the target angle, which is the variable that the subject must remember. You can see that this target angle is sustained through the delay. The subject can hang on to it. You can also decode the angle of the probe, which is distinct, and you can decode the tilt, which is the difference between the target and the probe. You can decode the probe phase, the decision of the subject. Most importantly, you can decode the visibility, which is the key variable here. The subject claims to have seen or not seen. Is this an objective fact in the brain? Yes, it is an objective fact in the brain, but only after a certain delay here. And you see it's sustained throughout the epoch. Another thing we can do here is take these decoders, so for instance, for the presence or absence of the stimulus, and we can ask how are these modulated by visibility or by contrast of the stimulus. So here's, I think, the most important discovery here. The early part of the epoch is modulated by objective parameters, such as the objective contrast of the stimulus. But only the late part of the epoch, and for a sustained duration, is modulated by subjective parameters, subjective visibility, seeing or not seeing. And this is reflected in the generalization across time. Here we see that seen and unseen trials are characterized once again by quite different generalization over time matrices. So what can we see here? Well, you can see the seen pattern. We can decode whether the target is present or absent throughout the epoch, including this long delay and even after the delay. When you've seen a piece of information, it stays in the system. It's a metastable representation. It's not a full square pattern, but nothing, we call it a thick diagonal. It's diagonal that expanded over time. There is metastability. For hundreds of milliseconds, the representations in the brain stay the same. But notice that we can also decode for a long time non-conscious, unseen trials. It's mostly at the beginning, but it's still towards the late part of the epoch. After 800 milliseconds here, we still get significant decoding. It's slowly decaying over time. It's this slow decay that allows subliminal information to stay enough in the system to afford above chance performance. So it's not as perfect as a sort of all or none transition. There's a little bit of a trace of the subliminal stimulus. And once again, we can ask how are these decoders impacted by objective factors, such as contrast, or by a subjective visibility factor. And we see this double dissociation, early for objective, late for subjective. So this is what we call conscious ignition. Notice that it's not completely a square pattern. It's a sort of thick diagonal now. It's a long trajectory of information processing. So I think I will not have time to go through all of the details. You'll have to look at the paper by Jean-Rémy King, but we can use this data to reject a lot of views on what is conscious processing. There are simple views such as re-entry, for instance. It's too simple. It does not predict the appropriate generalization over time for seen versus unseen trials, or late maintenance. It again predicts just a square. What we see requires a more hybrid model where there are processing stages that are amplified very strongly for conscious processing, and therefore conscious processing corresponds to a dynamic wave of sequential processing stages with metastable processing stages. They are not stable over infinite time, but they are stable over hundreds of milliseconds, and with an increasing amplitude of those late stages as a function of subjective visibility. So it's not completely all or none. This is true only in first approximation. And a non-conscious stimulus, as I said initially, may traverse virtually all of the same processing steps as a conscious one, but with a small amplitude and a short duration. It's not stable enough to be reported, to be used as flexibly as a conscious stimulus. So this is, of course, expected. You know, in a physical system, there is no such thing as all or none. There's always a sort of continuity of processing. But quickly, over time, the trajectories diverge and create a conscious state or a non-conscious state with strong differences. In the rest of the talk, I want to briefly say that what we saw at the level of external measures, such as EEG or MEG in humans, can also be found in the monkey. And in this case, we can go all the way down to single cells or to firing of populations of cells. In this lovely paper that I gave you for reading for this course, the team of Peter Rolfsema was able to record in a monkey that was reporting whether he was seeing or not. The task of the monkey was to look at the screen. There was a stimulus that was flashed, a very small dot, and sometimes there was no stimulus at all. And the monkey had to report whether he was seeing or not. And the monkey reported by moving his eyes to the dot if he was seeing it, but moving his eyes to a default dot if it was not seeing it. And the behavior of the monkey was very consistent with this notion of a stepwise function, just like for masking, even though here it's just a low intensity stimulus. At low contrast, the monkey reported not seeing, and there was a threshold, and then at high contrast, the monkey reported seeing and was able to make a saccade to the dot. And then Peter Roostemann's team was able to record from V1, V4, and prefrontal cortex in this task, and to gather enough trials to do the full signal detection theory of this situation, therefore to separate the trials where there was a stimulus and it was seen, where there was a stimulus and it was missed in red, and also the trials where there was no stimulus and it was rejected. And also there were a few trials where the monkey made a false alarm. And even though there was no dot at all, the monkey said, oh, I think there is one, which is a sort of hallucination, if you like. And the data was very beautiful. I won't have time to explain everything, but you notice that in area V1 and V4, you have these transients, and they are very much corresponding to non-conscious processing, because you can see that there can be very strong activation on the red trials here, which are misses. And there can be very much the same level of activation, depending on contrast, on seen versus misses. So visibility is not the key factor here. The key factor here is the contrast of the stimulus. But it's completely different in prefrontal cortex. And as predicted by the global workspace model, you can see that in prefrontal cortex, after a transition period, the trajectories diverge into a high level for the seen trials and the false alarm trials, and a low level for the unseen trials, where the activity remains very low here. Notice how it goes. It's really not completely all or none. It gets all or none at the end. But in between, there can be a transient activation on misses trial, where there is a little bit of activity, and then it goes down. This is typical of what is called a phase transition in brain activity. There is an initial failed ignition. It starts in the direction of ignition, but then it goes down, and there are really two attractors. This is well described, for instance, in the work of Xiaojing Wang as attractor systems, which can fall in a high state or in a low state. I realize I've been a little bit too ambitious in this talk, so I will go just very quickly, give you a flavor of the rest. First, there is a lot of debate as to whether what we see here is just due to the report of the animal. After all, the animal is reporting by moving his eyes, so maybe it's just a decision to move the eyes, which is responsible for this activity. Except that now there is a lot more data, and Fanis Panagiotopoulos, I see is in the audience here, did this work showing with Nikos Logothetis, showing that you don't have to have a reporting monkey. You can have a no-report paradigm where there's nothing to report. The monkey is just sitting there looking at the stimuli, and still you see these transitions in brain activity that correspond to this sort of ignition. So here it's in a paradigm where the monkey is having a high value stimuli. I believe it was explained yesterday in the course. I will not dwell on this. But just to say that there are cases where the monkey is not reporting. Here is one in the lab at Neurospin by Joachim Bellet and Fanis and other collaborators, where we record from Utah arrays from monkeys, and the monkey is just passively viewing the stimuli. And we are in prefrontal cortex. We present to the monkey either a single picture or a series of pictures. And Joachim was able to show that we can decode every single one of the pictures from the prefrontal cortex. This is in a condition where they're just barely visible, but if you're a human subject, the feeling is that you can see every one of the pictures just going very, very fast. So you could not report the identity of every one of them because they're not staying in your working memory, but they are visible, or most of them are visible. And what we see is that most of them are decodable. And if we look at the generalization across time matrix, what's very interesting is that all of the stages are there for every single of the pictures. They are just a little bit compressed in time. So the last item is uncompressed. It can stay for a long time, and that's the one you already see very well. But the other items in the series, they get this very short transient that still extend to all of the stages of a single item. You can see that you can still, the decoder that you train on a single item, even at 400 or 500 milliseconds, it is able to decode these flashed stimuli. It's just that the entire process seems to be very compressed. So the prefrontal cortex is traversed, as predicted, by waves of activity that reflect the very fast perception of the monkey. And I will finish by saying that we get the same sort of activity in a classical paradigm that we've introduced in the lab, which is called the local global paradigm. I will not have time to explain the previous results on auditory sequences, but I just mentioned that we are using now this paradigm with visual sequences. And this is the work of Marie Belay in the lab with Fanis and with Timo and other collaborators. What are we doing here? What we do is we present to the subject, to the monkey, a series of stimuli, and the last one can be the same or it can be different. So here we have a series of 4 pictures, for instance, 4 blue objects, or 4, I don't know what this object is, they have no names here, or 4 trucks, for instance. But in some trials, we also present 3 trucks and then suddenly an unexpected eagle, for instance, or vice versa here. And the first thing that you can see is that at this space, which is now relatively slow, 600 milliseconds, we can easily decode each and every one of these pictures. Whatever the identity of the image, there is a code in prefrontal cortex that is sufficiently detailed to decode the identity of this picture. But it goes way beyond that. And this is on my next slide. I would like to put up this motto here. Whatever the monkey knows, the prefrontal cortex encodes. Of course, what I mean is consciously knows. So let's look at this. First of all, as I just showed you, the stimulus identity, which picture just appeared, we can decode from prefrontal cortex. And we can decode regardless of whether it's a novel picture or not. So here is a case of BBBA, where it's 3 times the same pictures and there's a different one, and we can decode the identity of the last picture here. But we can also decode the number. We know that monkeys have number representations. Here, the monkeys know that this is the first picture, this is the second picture, this is the third, this is the fourth, and we can decode which number it is from the monkey's brain. And it's interestingly, when there is a novel picture at the end, there's a little bit of firing of the cells that say, oh, it's the first of its kind, if you like. We can also decode the novelty. So was the last picture different from the others? If it's a local deviance, the last picture is novel, it's a mismatch negativity, if you like, we can decode it from prefrontal cortex. And of course, you are conscious that the last item was different and unexpected. So very easy to decode. But we can also decode whether the entire sequence was unexpected. So what I did not tell you is that in some blocks, you expect the last one to be different because 80% of the trials are of this kind. And in other blocks, you expect the last one to be the same. You expect A. So in some blocks, which are depicted here by XX, you expect the last one to be identical. And in XY, you expect the last one to be different. And what we see here is that we can decode whether the sequence was expected or unexpected. This is a so-called global effect, global deviance. In our previous work, we showed that this is encoded only if the subject is conscious. So you lose this effect if the subject is, for instance, anesthetized or sleeping, or if the subject is in coma and so on. Well, or if the subject is simply distracted. Well, here we see that this effect when the subject is attending, this effect is present in prefrontal cortex. And the last thing which I really love is that we can see even before the sequence starts, even before the first item has appeared, we can see that the monkey knows what to expect. Since there is such a global effect, it's not surprising, but it's very nice to see it being encoded in prefrontal cortex. Even before the sequence starts, the monkey knows that he's in its XX block, and he knows, therefore, that the block should end with repeated stimulus. Or in another type of block, he knows that it is in the XY block. And this is decodable from the start of the sequence. So I think this is very nice proof that prefrontal cortex neuronal ensembles have all of the information that is consciously available to the monkey. I think I should probably stop so that we have time for questions. In this talk, I also wanted to let you know that these markers of consciousness, and especially this local versus global conscious response here, can be used as markers of consciousness in patients. But in patients, we have a variety of other measures of consciousness, many of them derived from this idea of global communication in the brain that can be used to diagnose and to help specify whether a patient that looks unconscious, for instance, is actually perhaps still a little bit conscious, like this some of the time. So this is becoming a very important topic in the clinic try to help with the diagnosis of patients that have disorders of consciousness. And so this is the most recent paper from Jacobo Sett and Dennis Angerman and Lionel Nakache and many other collaborators, showing how you can build robust EEG-based cross-site. That means we can record EEG, but the decoder has been trained in another site with another EEG device, and still we can detect whether consciousness was or was not present. So this is not just a theory, but this idea of global ignition and global communication is actually quite useful now in order to detect states of consciousness in the patients. I will stop here. Much of what I described is present in this book, Consciousness and the Brain, which I published a few years ago. If you want more recent ideas also about the contents of consciousness, specifically in humans, this is discussed in this newer book, How We Learn. I believe, I didn't have time to talk about that, but I believe that the contents of consciousness are richer in humans because of the presence of a language of thought. But this is not the time to discuss it now, maybe in the question time, if you have questions. So I think I will stop here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Great, then thank you very much for the wonderful talk. We have now a few minutes for questions, and we have several coming in through the chat. We'll start with one by Pachi, who asks, theories like the attentional schema theory propose that in order to have any conscious experience, the representation of the contents of consciousness is not enough, but instead we also need to represent the state of consciousness itself. How could a theory like the global neurals workspace theory, which is principally concerned about what information enters consciousness, accommodate this idea?
I'm not sure I understood the question. You were going very, very fast. And
yes, it's written in the chat. I can try to summarize it.
Okay, I need to stop sharing the screen, I guess. Okay.
So I think the summary is, how can the global neural workspace theory accommodate the idea that for conscious experience, you need two representations. You need a representation of the content of consciousness and a representation of the state of consciousness itself.
Well, okay, so in the science paper that I shared with you on whether machines could have consciousness, I discussed this idea that I think there are really two notions of consciousness here. One is that you have access to the information. This is the one I detailed here. Another is that you have a reflexive notion, a sense of yourself in the act of perceiving, a metacognitive state. I'm not sure that both are always needed in order to have a conscious state. So, well, I think when you are absorbed in a movie, you are not necessarily thinking about yourself in the act of perceiving. But if you want, you can. So it's part of the property of becoming conscious that you can also reflect on your own consciousness. You can, for instance, ask, did I really see this? Is this real or not? And so on and so forth. So I think this is a second stage, which is made accessible when an information is conscious. It's part of this circle of processes that speak to each other. There is one that is metacognitive in nature. I don't think it's indispensable, but I think it's a feature of having access to consciousness. In the paper, we actually discuss a bit more complex than that, because there are some metacognitive processes that already start without consciousness before you are conscious. So it's sort of a double axis. One is the metacognitive axis, the other is the access axis. And unfortunately, our meaning of the term consciousness at the moment does not well distinguish between these two terms. So I think we need to be a little bit careful.
Thanks. We have a couple of questions regarding what the theory would predict about lesions in the prefrontal cortex. Would it predict that people should have deficits in detection and identification of simple stimuli, or what kind of alterations in consciousness would you expect?
Right, yeah. Well, it's a very debated issue in the literature, because there are people who claim that lesions to the prefrontal cortex do not change anything with respect to consciousness. I think that's not true. But you can find some nice discussions by Aquan Low in particular in the literature. For instance, we did some work on masking. You need to use fine tests, basically. You cannot just sit there and say, is the patient still conscious? Well, first of all, you can fall into coma or vegetative state from massive lesions, bilateral to the prefrontal cortex. That does happen. And the lower metabolism in these associative areas is a marker of the loss of consciousness. So there is quite a bit of proof that this can happen. But if you have smaller lesions, then you have to be a little bit more careful. And so what we did is we measured the threshold for conscious access using this nice titration and this nice sigmoidal shape of perceiving as a function of the delay between the stimulus and the mask. And using that, we were able to show that unconscious processing was not affected, but conscious threshold was affected in frontal lobe patients. This is work with Antoine Delcu already some years ago. This is one piece of evidence. There are others. In general, the prediction is that it would take very particular lesion in order to knock out the whole workspace, right? It's a distributed system. I think this is what people do not understand. They always come back to prefrontal cortex. Right? This is not a localizationist theory. It's a distributed system, so it's not so easy to knock it out completely with a brain lesion. It needs to be a very particular kind of lesion. An interesting possibility is pharmacological lesion. In my book,
I think we may be having connection issues. I think it may be on Stan's end, because I can see everyone else fine.
Yeah, I think we might have lost Stan. Have we lost Stan?
Yeah, I think we lost him.
Well, that's sad. Maybe we can give him a couple of minutes to try to rejoin.
Yeah.
Maybe somebody else can answer the questions.
Funny, certainly, the pharmacology.
It was really interesting.
Yeah, it was fascinating discussion.
Can also take a couple of minutes break, see if before we start Lucia's talk, he has managed to come back in to finish explaining that one last question. I can keep an eye to see if he can rejoin.
That's a good idea. So 2-minute break?
2-minute break.
Yeah, 2-minute break.
Thank you.
Hey, Lou, Stan.
Stan's back. Yeah.
I think you cut off and we went for a break.
Everything crashed. Well, not everything, just Zoom. I'm not sure what happened. Were you still online?
Oh,
Yeah,
hi,
I
Stan.
think we were, yeah.
I'm sorry, I don't know what happened. I think it's my local Zoom for some reason.
No
now
problem.
I'm in a browser. Were there any other questions?
There were several, but I think we were wondering if you could finish your comment on the pharmacological lesions that we were keen to hear about.
I'm so sorry.
No problem.
Yeah.
You put too much pharmacology right at that time. You knock us out.
I became unconscious. That's right.
Exactly.
Hello, Lucia. I'm sorry I will not stay for your entire presentation.
No problem. You know what I'm going to be talking about, so
I guess so. Except if you show the results. By the way, after the publication of the science paper, I got an angry email from Jean-Rémy. I don't know if he sent you one, because he was unhappy because the paper that I just described, with the generalization over time of consciousness was not cited. And because it's much more subtle than the sort of square figure that you show in the science paper, which I also criticized at the time, actually, if you remember. Yeah. So he said, this square pattern we can already exclude completely.
It's not real data, right? This
exactly.
is the beautiful thing about a model versus the data.
It's a caricature.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, but in a sense, we've already rejected that. Yeah. So I was happy to describe this model a little bit again this morning, the neuron paper by Jean.
Okay, so maybe that's a good time to transition to the next talk. And thanks, San, again for the great talk and the questions. So our next speaker today is Lucia Meloni. She is a professor at the Max Planck Institute for Empirical Aesthetics. And she works in domain general cortical computations, and she's done some very interesting work in the neural correlates of consciousness as well. And she will be talking to us about the 3Cs project, collaborating to crack consciousness. Lucia, when you're ready.
If you enable me to share my screen, I would be happy to.
Yes, I think I should have done that, but
it's
okay.
I mean, perhaps it's on my
now
end.
It should be fine.
Yeah. Now this should be. You're seeing my screen now. Do you see yourself as well? I never know where to put all of this.
No, it's fine. We see your full screen.
Okay, yes. Great, cool. So I'm going to be talking about a project that Stan is a integral part on. So it's good if he stays a little bit, but if not, then at least you will see that he already spared me all of the introductions on his theory, which is part of the things that we're going to be doing today as well. And part of this project aims at, so yesterday, Matthias gave some beautiful presentations of this history of endless debates, which, in a sense, this project is trying to find a way to, not shortcut them, but, make some progress in those endless debates, right? And the mechanism that you will hear about today is adversarial collaboration. So I hope that, I convince you that perhaps there is some way to make progress, not just, continue debating for centuries. But before I start on talking a little bit more about the project, let me just start by setting up the ground in terms of what we think we would like to explain. And the question at hand is, how can we explain situations such as this one? So experiences such as being excited, when you go for a fly, when you, taste a really nice wine, when you actually feel the excruciating pain of a vaccination, hopefully a COVID vaccine that is going to protect you, or when you are actually, like in a very sad moment. The question then becomes, what is similar to all of those situations? And what we think it's similar to those is experience, which in some senses we're conscious of certain, emotions or content at that time. So what is the definition that I will try to go with in this presentation is experience is, consciousness is defined as experience, which may or may not be reflected in overt behavior. And I think this is something that, that we need to always be, mindful about. And even when Stan actually refers about access, he doesn't necessarily mean access, like in terms of overt behavior, but it's access for the mind. Right. It's private in the sense that, you know, we have an intimate experience with it. So we all know when we're conscious about something. The problem becomes like, think of, you know, of a dream, for instance. Like you have this extremely vivid and lucid moments, yet, you know, from the outer's perspective, perhaps people actually don't know that you are alive and that you are having this very, you know, vivid, you know, auditory and visual experiences. So for your own, from your own internal perspective, these are undeniable. And they are direct. So for us, we don't need to, you know, like have any like ruler nor any measurement device to convince ourselves that we are conscious. We know when we are, and we know that when we go to sleep and we are not having any dreams, we are kind of like in a blackout moment. I don't know what happens to you, but at least to me, I have this extremely vivid experience of, you know, like I wake up and I'm there, I'm having my dreams and I'm there, and in between, I'm just not there, you know, and some time may have passed, but it's just black. You know, I don't really have a sense that, you know, like I was really there. And this was recognized, you know, like really, 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 you know, many, many years ago by this idea of Descartes that, you know, we might not know what consciousness is, but one thing that we do know is that it exists, you know. And the idea is that, you know, you can doubt anything, but not the existence of consciousness. So in a sense, I think that this puts us in a really nice scenario because, you know, we might not necessarily know a lot of the, you know, objects in the outer world, but we do have an intimate experience with our own experience, and that is undeniable for us. Yet, as scientists, there is this problem, you know, that we have to solve somehow, which is the so-called subjectivity gap. Even though we know very clearly from our own perspective what consciousness is and when we are conscious and or not, and what we are experiencing, from the outer perspective, this is not really easy, right? And we do, and I think yesterday was a beautiful talk about binocular rivalry. And so, you know, we, for instance, present images to the eyes of the subject, and then the perception goes back and forth between one and the other. And the only thing that we can actually rely on is either, you know, a report of the subject, like I see red or I see green, or, you know, say optogenetic nystagmus, or some kind of like over behavior by which we can tell that the subject is actually having an experience. And this is kind of like the trap that we have. So we need to somehow objectivize something that is from the internal, from a first person perspective into a third person perspective. This actually also goes into you know, situations such as, for instance, synesthesia. So I'm not a synesthete. I don't know, you know, perhaps one of you has the, you know, the beautiful extra sensations. I don't, like, unfortunately. But if you do, for instance, you will see this text completely colorful and really, really nice for you, right? And this tells us that, you know, we also have this plurality of experiences, you know, which is also an interesting aspect if we think about, like, we always think that the way in which we experience is the way in which the world appears for us, and the way in which the world is, but actually isn't in some sense. Right? Some people actually would have experiences such as synesthesia, which others may not. And so some years ago, we tried to capture what we call the so-called perceptual phenotypes. You know, under the idea that, you know, some individuals may have different experience than others. And the question was, can we have a behavioral measure that will allow us to capture these differences? And we started with people that have synesthesia. As I told you, these are individuals that in the most common form, if you present them a letter, they will actually have a systematic experience of color. So say like the 4 will always be red, or A will always be red, or 5 will always be 6, 5 will always be red, and so on and so forth. It varies among synesthetes. So it doesn't mean that, you know, like A is always red. For some synesthetes, it may be red, some others can be green, and so on and so forth, right? But it's systematic for a given individual. So they have extra sensations, so to speak. This is not a neurological condition. When people are normal, they just, you know, they have the nice capacity of actually experiencing more than us. Right? On the other end, we have people that actually have schizophrenia. And patients that have schizophrenia, one of the things that has been shown before is that they are less subjective to illusions. So for instance, in this case, in this case, the size of this circle is exactly the same as this one. And the only reason why you perceive it as smaller, or in this case larger, is because of the surrounding circles, right? So one of the things that the patients with schizophrenia actually have is that they are less subjective to this illusion. So they perceive the world as it is, much less than, you know, like based on these priors. And in an attempt to try to capture these differences in perception, we ran a very simple paradigm in which we presented, in this case, subjects with synesthesia, control subjects, as well as schizophrenics, with letters that will be unraveling from this noise, right? And we titrated the amount of noise that it has, so then at some point the subject will actually completely see them, as you see in this case. And what we manipulated was whether we presented letters that would actually, or numbers, for which the synesthete would have these extra sensations, and therefore they should be able to see more, or symbols for which the synesthete will not have an extra sensation, and therefore they wouldn't see more, right? So in essence, you can turn any synesthete into a control every time you show them a stimulus for which they don't have this extra sensation. And the question was, will they differ in the threshold of perception? And this is what we can observe. So this is how many stimuli the subjects report to see. This is the level of noise. So from completely noise to the letter being completely clear. And these are the three populations. So you can see is, let's start with the red. This is the normal subject. What we observe is that in this case, the people with synesthesia, they can perceive more stimuli for a given level of sensory noise. And in contrast, the patients with schizophrenia, they actually perceive less for the same level of sensory noise. So in some sense, we can capture this, what we call, again, perceptual phenotypes. And if this is true, what you would expect is that subjects will not have this, in particular the synesthetes, will not have this advantage when you turn them into non-synesthetes. So in this case, we're presenting now symbols for which they don't have these extra sensations. And the psychometric curves are actually exactly the same in between controls and synesthetes, but they still are worse in the case of the schizophrenics, right? So this tells us that, I think that we psychologists have become a little bit better at, try through experimentation to capture this richness of the experience. So in that sense, we have made some progress. And because of that, like Matthias made the case yesterday that the program of the NCC was not discovered or launched by Christoph Koch, which he's right. The interesting aspect is that one of the things that Christoph Koch and Francis Crick did was to somehow set up a framework, or in which we can put the kind of studies that we run. And the idea here was, let's try to have the hard problem aside, and let's try to focus on the so-called easy problem, right? And the idea here would be like, let's just search for the minimal neural mechanism that is jointly sufficient for any conscious experience. In this case, the NCC will be of a person will be any time. If you can stimulate that NCC, you will elicit that experience. And if you can obliterate that NCC, you will eliminate that experience, right? That's the idea of causation. And even though Francis Crick and Christoph Koch did not invent it, like the studies on consciousness, what they definitely did is that they launched as a massive increase in the amount of researchers or in the amount of studies that then started investigating this. So this is the amount of, if you just run a simple PubMed search with consciousness, awareness, and neural, by the 1990s, there's something like 16 papers a year. By 2020, you have 594. So you can see the steep increase in studies, right? But of course, this is a much, this is not a problem that was invented in the 90s, right? That would be absolutely not right to say. Now, the part of the beauty about the program that they set up was its simplicity, right? And the simplicity started from the fact that what they saw is like, let's start with this idea of the contrastive method, and it's in its a basic form is actually really simple. The idea is that you present a stimulus, let's say like ad limen, as Matthias was saying yesterday. So sometimes you perceive it, sometimes you don't. So in the question, in this case would be, I present you always a stimulus which has the same contrast, but in certain occasions, I ask the subjects and they say like, yes, I perceive it. They press a button. I take those trials as trials in which subjects are aware. In other cases, I present the very same stimuli. The subject says that it hasn't perceived it. I leave it as unaware. And then we contrast activity between the cases when the subjects report it, or by some means they gave us information that they have perceived versus don't. And the idea was literally a subtraction, a simple subtraction in the brain. So whatever remains when I contrast these two is the NCC, right? And we psychologists, like we have invented, we have at hand a large array of different techniques by which we can make stimuli unconscious. We can use continuous flash suppression, We can use binocular rivalry. You heard about that yesterday. We can use masking. This is what Stan was showing you today. Attentional blink. This is also a lot of Stan's work actually is based on the attentional blink. So there is a number of experiments that we can actually take to in some sense, erase a stimulus from awareness, right? So and that, in that sense, we have no problem. And because we have no problem, then the idea was, well, then let's start contrasting these two conditions, right? And I'm just going to show you one experiment from my lab and then one from Fanny's. Where what we did in this case was presenting stimuli to subjects that have epilepsy, and they will tell you later on why it actually becomes interesting. We presented natural images, and then we put noise on them, right? And so in this case, what we're doing is manipulating the visibility, right? We collected data from intracranial EEG. So in this case, these are patients that have epilepsy. Only in those conditions we can actually have access to the brain from within with very nice temporal and spatial resolution. So in these cases are stereo EEG. So these are electrodes that go into the brain, as you can see here. And what is nice about that is that then we can actually have electrodes implanted in a particular area, which is the so-called fusiform phase area, which, as we know, is extremely selective to phases. So the question in this case becomes, what will happen to that particular area when subjects declare to see a stimulus versus when they don't? And we repeat, and in fact, we just replicated studies that have done before by Stan and Rafi Malach and many others, like Victor Lame, in which the seen stimuli, in this case here, you're seeing a power in the high gamma, which is an interesting signal from stereo EEG, is much higher in the case when the subjects see something versus when the subjects don't see something. So by this means, we would conclude that there is correlates of consciousness in the visual cortex, right? So we're happy the paper got published. Then the next, the next example I'm going to show you is one in which Fanny has investigated binocular rivalry. So in this case, this, as you heard yesterday, in binocular rivalry, you present two stimuli, two independent stimuli to each eye, and the brain gets confused, so it cannot actually see these two things. So it swings between one percent and the other, right? And we can ask subjects to tell us what they have been perceiving. In this case, say red or blue, except that in this case, these were not human subjects; these were monkeys. And what Fanny sees in this beautiful paper, which you should definitely see, is that you should definitely read, is that what he did was to implant electrodes, in this case in prefrontal cortex, and observe and obtain, in this case, single units, right? And he obtained a really exquisite correlates of perception. So in this case, if the monkeys declared to perceive the stimuli, the neurons would fire much more strongly. If that very same stimuli will go into unconscious, the monkeys would not be perceiving that, it would have no activity. But now if they perceive something else, and the other neuron would actually have very strong responses, right? So it's as you see, it cannot get better in a way. Like it's a really exquisite correlate, right? But now you would say, well, so we have correlates in prefrontal, we have correlates in visual cortex. So, and when people started doing these experiments after 30 years, and I showed you the exponential growth, we find correlates almost everywhere. So it's not in some sense, it's not very selective. And then we started thinking about why it might actually not be selective per se, right? And this is I think that it's probably an argument that will become clear to all of you, is that if you think about as consciousness happening in a causal chain of events in the brain, then you would have to assume that there is processes that antecede the fact that the stimuli was conscious. These are the so-called NCC preceding responses. So think of this, like subjects would pay more attention, or there will be, like changes in fluctuation in the baseline, or something that actually caused that stimulus that which otherwise would have been the same. So imagine it's a lemon that brought it into consciousness, but those processes might actually be A, not necessary, B, not sufficient, and furthermore, they may actually be unconscious, right? Even probably more problematic is the fact that we may have, so if we think of consciousness doing something in the brain and in cognition, we would have to assume that it also alters the follow-up processes, right? What we call like the NCC consequences. So think the easiest example of this for me is episodic memories. So think of, every time you see something, you actually form a rich episodic memory of what you have experienced. And if you haven't seen that, then perhaps you actually don't form that memory. So in some sense, every time we have consciousness, we will have the aftermath, right? And so, if just out of the box, the simple contrast may yield more than just the simple one NCC, right? And this is what we call the so-called like 3 NCC. So the NCC precursors, the NCC consequences, and the proper NCC. And this has led to a lot of debate. I just put you here one example, because there's a lot, part of the debate on the whole role of the prefrontal cortex is that some proponents claim that prefrontal cortex activity relates to task. For instance, it's the fact that the subjects are put on reporting that actually light up prefrontal cortex. But if subjects don't have to do that, then that prefrontal cortex activity is not there, right? Not that the debate is resolved, but this is some of the claims. So if we have this 3 NCC problem, this means that we need to somehow make the program more, more sensitive, right? And which solutions may we have? And we thought about 2 of them, and in the paper, of course, there's many more, but I'm going to just present you 2 here. And one was, let's try to start from deduction, the so-called like top-down approach. What if we actually start from the theories? We derive observations, and then we try to get to conclusions. So in this case, what if we actually start from G and W? We try to predict what G and W, hopefully, and counterintuitive observation of G and W. And then if we obtain evidence for that, then it would be a way to confirm predictions from G and W. An alternative approach, which is actually if you think about the NCC program set up by Christoph Koch and Francis Crick, was this induction. Actually, what the idea they had in mind was, let's just collect a bunch of data, and let's try to analyze them and come up with a theory, right? And I'm putting those as two independent approaches, but in a way, if you think about them, actually they can live together, right? So you can start from in an inductive way, and then actually move into a deductive way, right? So once you build up the theories, then you can actually propose, okay, so what would I expect if this is the case, right? So let's start with the first approach. As you know, Stan already presented to you his theory, learner workspace theory, but there is others. I here present some, like recurrent processing, integrated information theory. These are not all of them. Actually, there is many more. And this is a very nice paper by Camillo Signorelli, which, if you want to read more about, like in which ways these models differ, I think that this is a good summary. And so you can see here, like, GNW, recurrent processing, IAT, high order theories, and so on and so forth. There's actually many, as you see, right? And the problem actually of not the problem, but I guess it's probably part of the natural way in which science progresses, is that if you take actually the last 20 years of research, which is what Itai and Liat did, they actually look at, so what happens in terms of support and challenging evidence for each of these theories. So they looked at papers in this case, completely at face value. So whatever way the authors happen to have interpreted that for different theories. So in this case, GNW, recurrent processing, IAT, and HOT. And they found out that there's a lot of experiments, in fact, that actually support GNW, and very few that challenge it. But it's the same trend for all of the different theories, right? Probably even more problematic is the fact that, one would expect that, as one theory has more evidence, somehow others tend to kind of like, disappear. This is not what the data shows. In fact, if you take the number of experiments over the years for the different theories color-coded here, as you can see, all of them have been growing. All of them have been growing in support, so having more support for this doesn't mean that, like there's less support for IIT. And they have all, only kind of like recently been challenged, which I think is an interesting and good trend. Probably it's a healthy. It shows that we are going into a healthy hesitation regarding our own theories. So how do we know which one of these theories are better, or which results are more stable? By what mechanism can we drive this process for decision making, right? Interestingly enough, one of the mechanism that one may have is this so-called adversarial collaboration. which was not necessarily, even though it's one of the biggest proponents is Kahneman, who's a psychologist and a Nobel Prize winner. The idea of actually doing this in the conscious research actually came from a interesting foundation that sits in the Bahamas called the Templeton Ward Charity Foundation, and by this particular gentleman, David Podgitter, who is the program officer. And so he actually came up with this idea that can we actually try to accelerate research on consciousness by comparing theories in an adversarial collaboration. And so this is what we are doing currently. This is a project that Stan is involved, and we're comparing his theory, global workspace theory, against integrated information theory by Giulio Tononi and Christoph Koch. Right? What is relevant is not only what we are doing, but also how we are doing it. So our approach to attempt to accelerate research was, on the one hand, team up with, in this case, Giulio and Stan, and come up with experiments that would hopefully not only find the commonalities among those theories, but also what are the points of divergence? What are the critical points in which one theory would predict one thing and the other theory would predict something else, right? And when we're with them through that process, such that they will also check that this prediction checked in terms of their theories, not just our interpretation of their theories, but also what they think themselves about their theories, right? The next thing is, as you know, the methods that we have that are available for human experimentations are all in some ways limited. So either they have very good spatial resolution or very good temporal resolution, but there is very few that actually have both. So we try to actually have a multi-model assay in this case, in which we were running experiments with fMRI, with EMG and EEG integrated, as well as with electrocorticography. So this is an array of invasive and non-invasive studies. We also try to do highly powered studies, because very often what we do, partly because like limitations in the funding, we run studies with select 20 subjects, but we know that the results scale up with the amount of subjects that, or the stability of the results scale up with the amount of subjects that we have. So in this case, we try to actually do this in the level of the hundreds, right, and not just like 20. The next was, well, when you actually do this, you have to standardize your materials. And, like this is a process that I painfully learned. It's actually much more difficult and much more challenging than people think, because really making, like the same experiment run in 6 laboratories in the same way, such that, like you get results that are comparable, is not that trivial. So this actually told me something really interesting about what replication means and what are the limits of replication. But furthermore, we wanted to do it in such a way that we could convince ourselves that the results that we obtain are stable. So we're running each experiment in fMRI, in EMG, and in ECOG in 2 independent laboratories. And the idea here is that they should replicate across techniques, they should replicate across laboratories, and they should replicate across samples of individuals that span from participants in China to the United States to Europe and so on. And finally, this is a large project that is actually a lot of people. So what is really cool is that even though Stan and Giulio were part of devising the experiments and the predictions and etc., they are not actually the ones collecting the data. This is done by independent laboratories who are experts in each of these techniques, right? All right, and if you want to read more about this, one of the things that we are very committed to is to have the process in an open way, meaning that everyone can, everyone can say that they like it or that they don't, and if they don't like it, they can actually say why, and this is, you already heard, Stan say, like Jeremy, complain. That's exactly what we want. We want to thrive healthy, controversies, So if you actually have your opinions, here you go. You can go read them, and send them an email to me, to Stan, to Giulio, whoever in the consortium. And the idea of this is that actually we will be documenting all of the process. So every time things are being updated, this is going to be shown there. So check it out. So what do we have? We have 2 experiments, one in which it's a very simple one, but I think that it's nonetheless extremely powerful, in which we are presenting one stimulus alone in the middle of the screen. And the only task of the subject is to just be conscious of the stimulus and be conscious of the stimulus for different amount of time. So we are manipulating, in this case, the category of the stimulus that we are showing. So either faces, objects, letters, or fonts. So the content of the experience. We're also manipulating the content in terms of each of the stimuli are presenting different orientations. But we therefore, a face in some sense seen from the side, in your experience, is not the face seen from the front. right? Even though, of course, a phase neuron will actually integrate over those and will generalize, but your experience is definite. And furthermore, this stimuli are being presented for different durations, 500, 1,000, and 1,500 milliseconds. And the idea here is to look for what are the correlates or the brain responses in terms of maintaining a stimulus in perception, not just what makes it to enter, as which is what Stan was showing you now, but what actually keeps it there. Because I have, I hope that I have not disappeared, even though you have been like listening to me, or you have been seeing me for almost 20 minutes. Right, and so the idea here is to look for the kind of activities that GNW and IIT would predict in terms of how the stimuli are maintaining perception, and they make actually very opposite predictions. So for GNW, as you heard from Stan, GNW predicts this very strong ignition that reflects the update of the content. So therefore, it will be an update at the beginning of the experience as well as at the end of the experience. Whereas in the case of GNW, they predict that the whatever cause effect structure or the physical substrate should actually be maintained in its unfold fashion throughout the experience, right? And the second one is it's a complex video game that Liad and Mike actually put together. It's a lot of work, and it's very difficult, but at the same time, it's actually exciting that they are trying to go for more naturalistic situations in which we manipulate consciousness. So in this case, subjects are tasked with only playing the video game, and from time to time we present them either faces or objects in 4 different locations, and the subjects have to tell us whether they have been seeing them or not. And in both of these experiments, we manipulate the task relevance and the task irrelevance of the stimuli, right? And this is a part of trying to get at this prediction of what is the prefrontal cortex actually doing. If you want to really arbitrate, you have to have a list of outcomes and interpretations for each of those outcomes, which is what you see here, right? So for each of the theories, for GNW as well as for IIT, we map out what are the outcomes for experiment 1, what are the outcomes for experiment 2, that would be most diagnostic for either GNW to pass, to fail, or to be challenged. And the idea of the challenge here is that we may not really know whether or not it's the theory prediction does not borne out, and this is because of the methods, right? That we need to recognize the limitations of the methods. So in some sense, if there's better methods, we can probably address a lot of these things in a better way, which is, for instance, one of the things that Fanis is trying to do with targeted recordings in monkeys, which we cannot really do in humans, right? As I told you, it's a large set of collaborators. So we have an ECOG team, an fMRI team, an EMG team, a data monitoring team composed of Stan, Julio, Liad, and Mike, and their postdocs and students, to actually look that the data themselves are actually of sufficient quality, right? Because if you collect bad data, of course you're going to get bad results, but this is for trivial reasons, right? So you would agree with me that at least minimal, you need to say like the data are decent. We have data science collaborators, advisors, of course, the adversaries, and Liad, Mike, and myself, like the center PIs. And as I told you, these are the data that we would have across all of the subjects. So, we're collecting 100 subjects for each of the experiments, 15 each of the labs, right? So this is us in October 2019, when we thought that the world was great and we would actually do this, and we were super happy about launching this, and like Liad was saying that we're going to be shooting to the moon, and like this got corona, and like a lot of these things just got it's been a difficult year, but I have to tell you guys that despite the severe delays that we suffer, we have an amazing group of PhDs and postdocs, and they have actually been able to now even collect and complete the full data acquisition for EMG. For fMRI, I think that Aya will actually have all of the data collected by July. And ECOG is a little bit more slow, but we hope that all of the data will be collected by mid-2020. Why are we excited about this? Is because we think that, and why are we excited, and why we think that you should be excited, is because we don't want to make this just like this closed circle, this closed Toby family that like sit down in that fancy room at the SFN, but we want to make this a collective enterprise. So eventually, all of this data, we hope that you will dig into them, and you will use them to either test further predictions from these 2 theories, or any other prediction that you guys may actually can think about that. And so all of the methods will be shared, so including the video game, the data, as well as analysis tools. And so we hope that you will be able to also, tell us something more, especially considering that we have probably that we will have, if we pull it through, one of the best multimodal data sets, so far. So why to bother, about doing this? Because it's a lot of people, it's a lot of, effort. These are not my theories, just for the record, and I am personally very excited because I think that one of the ways in which one can stop the endless debates, and Matthias actually touch upon that, is because it forces people to make explicit their background predictions and their background assumptions, and by doing so, then we can actually drive progress. Also, I hope that because we are now comparing them in a I don't think we necessarily will completely eliminate one theory, but at least we will definitely challenge them, and in ways in which they will need to accept the results and resolve the discrepancies. I also believe that this will help us increase the confidence in the field, because as I told you, you will have access to the data, the pre-registration, the predictions. You can disagree with us, and I think this is healthy. This is the science at least I would like to be a part of. I don't know about you, but this is the science that I stand by. And it's not a new approach to science. I think that people have been trying to do this. We just hope that we will set up an example, by demonstrating that this can be done. It's hard, yes, but it is possible. So now, this so long about the beauty, but it is actually complicated. And I don't want to deny this. And it's complicated because of the sociology. Not everybody is like Stan and Julio. And this requires a different mindset. So you want to, you need to think about this as cooperative pursuit as versus the competitive rivalry, which is the way in which very often set up academia, right? So I thrive because you lose, right? And also it's costly, if we want to do science this way, it actually draws a lot of resources, because you need to pay, for a lot of data, you need to make them, fair and so on and so forth, and that is costly and this is difficult. But probably the largest problem is credit assignment. So now we have a huge team of a lot of, really insanely talented PhD students and collaborators and postdocs. But how can we say, okay, so Alex did this, Aya did that, we're going to end up with some chunk publication with, a lot of names, and it's going to be difficult for their tenure. So we are very committed to actually also thinking about how can we do this in a different way? How can we attribute a credit in a fair way, and also while advancing their careers, right? And also this is something that I recognize as we were doing the project, that it needs a lot of competences, like doing open science and collecting these so-called metadata. People don't actually, they only collect data. They don't collect metadata. But if you want to actually make your data reusable, it doesn't matter that you collect the data. You need to collect metadata. And it's actually very difficult to collect metadata and to have them in such a way that it are machine readable, usable, and so on and so forth. So I'm happy to talk about that if you have questions. Are we the only ones doing this? No. This is the beauty about it. We were the first, but not the last, luckily. And so this is Fanis, who I think it was on the call before. He's been doing this, the same IIT GNW, but now in animals. So we will not only have a lot of data from different techniques, but also from different species. These are this is the team led by Ned Vlog, Jan, David, Rachel, Biju, and Megan, where they actually testing first order theories of consciousness against higher order theories of consciousness. And this is a new team being built up now, trying to test predictive processing against integrated information theory. Right. And how much more time do I have, guys?
So we should actually be wrapping up. There's now like 5-10 minutes for questions. So
can I go 2 more minutes or what?
Two more minutes, and we'll have time for a couple of questions. 2 minutes is fine.
Okay, yeah. Cool. So let me just very briefly sketch you because this is a so-called first approach, which is top-down one, right? Which is great, but and I really live by this quote: all models are wrong, some are useful. So I think that the best way to go is to actually put this approach together again in unison with a bottom-up approach. but how do we do science or how do we do theory development with this, like large set of data that we have currently? And this is not an easy thing. How do we typically accrue data? We do, like reviews, which is great, but they are just authored by, with that particular perspective, right? This is a huge effort, like from Tal Jerkoni. He put together these neurosynth, it's just only fMRI, it's only activation, it's only threshold, it's better than nothing, but it's limited. This is Liad with her contrast database. So she was trying to actually look at how can we accrue the data that we have already in the field. She revealed all sorts of trends, like for instance, if you actually look at the areas in the brain, depending on like the theories, the people that have actually run those papers, the areas in the brain look very different. If you put them all together, then you end up with a almost entire brain. So that already tells you there's something interesting, like here going on. So there is confirmation bias. And we know that this is a thing, and we know that from other meta science studies, we know that it's actually not that easy to know which results in science are right and which results are wrong. We have the what I think is actually a larger crisis, which is the so-called generalization crisis, which is the fact that we say usually that like our results generalize over conditions, but we never test that, right? And this is something that needs to be done in a proper way, versus there is a lot of variability. Even if we take one data set, we give people like the same instructions, they just do all sorts of things, so it's not that easy. So how can we go about this? I do think that we need to work on the so-called like metadata. So we should do like format standardization. We should collect data, this so-called like electronic laboratory notebook. We should share this data, but they will only be useful if we can actually also run a search over them. Because just having data dumped somewhere is better than having it in your own cabinet. But if you don't know what you did and the others don't know what you did and how to find them, it's also as if they weren't there, right? And also we need to track that the data are good, right? So we're doing this for our particular project, trying to create an electronic laboratory notebook and run the so-called like Elasticsearch through this blue-brain nexus, which I'm happy to share with you later on. But and if we are successful, what we hope is that this will all be open source, so you will also be able to use it later on. And this is like my vision. So I really hope that one day, guys, we will just be able to have data, to have access to all of the data we already have. So it's not that we don't have them, right? They're just not accessible. And if we do that, then perhaps we can build a huge laboratory by doing crowdsourced science. So I hope that this is a path to resolve endless debates. I'm not sure when this is true or not, but at least it is the path that I had, laid out for myself, at least for the next 5 to 10 years. And I hope that with this we can actually, answer some hard questions. So what happens with patients that actually have brain damage, or fetuses, or robots, or other species, right? And I want to thank actually these people, and I want you to, I always end up with this because I think that science is done by people, and these are the people that actually are doing the huge and heavy lifting of this project. These are the postdocs and the PhD students in the team. These are the arrays. These are the PIs that we had. I mentioned to you the advisors, and this is Liad and Mike, who are my two collaborators and partners in crime in this. And with that, I want to thank you, and I want to invite you. This is something that I think Stan did not mention, because I think that the post ends on the 18th of July, but perhaps we can convince him, because he has a postdoc open, and so does Floris, but the deadline is tomorrow. So if you want to join us, just hurry up.
Great. Thank you very much, Lucia, for this very interesting talk, and for the presentation of the adversarial approach that we will learn more about in the afternoon. So before we go to the lunch break, we have time for a couple of questions. We already have some in the chat by Alejandro, who is asking a couple of things. So one is, what happens after we get the results from these experiments? In other words, what does it mean that one of the theories fails or passes the theory? How do we go from there? Do we change the theories to try to accommodate these new findings? Do we just abandon them forever and forget they existed? Or what do we do?
So, the answer is, my personal interpretation of what I would like the process to be. But as you know, like science is psychology, is people, and minds doing things, right? And so in an ideal scenario, I don't think that we should refute the theories per se, in the sense that, and I think Elizabeth is going to present later on the idea of history of, philosophy of science. I don't think that we are running any Popperian, thing where, we just falsify and then we're done and, we move on. I do think that we have to, probably have many more anomalies being accrued to then say that a theory as such is wrong. Yet what I would hope minimally that will tell us is that a theory will need to either patch up, because in essence, whatever way you think about it, the theory was not able to predict that finding. So in some sense, it will have to be revised. And from my point of view, very often people, focus on the ones who win. I focus on the one who loses, because I think that the only way where I gain any knowledge is on the one that loses. The one that wins, it doesn't tell me anything about, it may lose the next battle. It doesn't matter, in some sense, I'm not gaining any confidence per se on that theory. It's just I haven't been able to, create troubles, right? So I think that, we will definitely learn from the problems that they have. But on a larger note, and that's why I present you in very brief strokes, the last part of this El Alma laboratory that I really, think about, is because, what are there, so we're testing two theories, but what if actually both are wrong? And that's what I told you, all models are wrong, some are useful. So, what I really hope that it will happen is that this, nice circle of, we test certain theories, they get in trouble, we revise them, they continue getting in trouble, and then eventually, we just say, look, this just didn't work, whatever. These are the ones that stay in the race, fine. But perhaps also with all of this data that we will have, that we don't have yet, we will be able to come up with actually a better theory. I don't dismiss that that next possibility, right? So whatever whatever happens, I think that it's going to be positive for the field. That's my. Yeah. But I'm optimistic. I'm pathologically optimistic.
I think I agree. I think it's, that also answers Alejandro's second question, which is what implications does this kind of project have for other theories? And the idea is that whatever comes out of these experiments is also relevant to other theories potentially.
Yeah. And one thing that I want you guys to think about, which at least to me, it was a big, it's a big motivation. So, because a lot of people hate what we're doing, and I think that for good reasons. Some of them hate it because we are attracting a lot of resources, right? And you can say, well, with this mega project, we can actually fund small, grants for I don't know how many people, right? Which is true, right? The way in which I think about that conundrum is the following. Very often, we don't share our data. We don't do it in such a way that the data can be reused, and therefore, actually, you're losing money. And there is actually data out there showing how much money we are losing by the mere fact that we are not sharing them in a proper way. So what I hope at the same time is to use this mechanism to democratize science, right? Because I grew up in Chile. In Chile, we don't have fMRIs. In Chile, we don't have images, and we will never have. And if they have one, I would say they're crazy. They have much more, problems. So let's just first get poverty cover, and then we buy an image. Right? But now, if you are in Africa, you're in Chile, or you're wherever, you can go and download the data and participate in a democratic way in science. So, at least to me, this is another thing that is really important, and I feel that I need to kind of convey, because I want you to understand that, okay, it's true, it's a lot of resources, but if you use them well and you reuse them well, you're actually investing. That's the way in which I think about it.
Well, I think we just have to thank you again, Lucia, for ending in this very optimistic note, and for the great talk and discussion. And it's now time for our lunch break. So I would invite again all of you to join us in the Gather Town Cafe that we have. I just posted the link to the chat if you wish to talk to other people. And we will continue with the afternoon session in 45 minutes. So see you all then.
And then I'll see you in this adversarial exercise, right?
Yes, exactly. We will start this exercise in 45 minutes.
Thank you for the invitation. Like this was fun. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks for accepting.
Thanks so much, Lucia. That was fantastic.
Cool. Take care, guys. See you soon. Ciao, ciao.
See you soon.